Because Casey, I think what you're getting at too is like kind of the more like how I feel about editing just as a whole, and particularly for vocals, is that like you want it all to feel like one natural take. Unless there is a specific stylistic choice that's gonna like make it feel as though like you're shifting into a different space, or you're like as far as the composition goes, if there's a shift, that's one thing. But I feel like for the most part, particularly when it comes to main vocals and stuff like that, you want everything to feel as though it was done in a single take. And good to those who do get it in the single take. That's awesome. Hats off to you. But I'm certainly not too proud to say that that I needed to be edited, all the time. And that's like when you get into that sort of granular level of editing, there has to be a give and take to find out, like, when I play this back, am I listening to something that feels like it was done all at one time? Because like even sometimes on a vocal take or something like that, if like the singer moves away from the mic a little bit more, or like there's a mild change within like the environment, I may take the take that like fits more with the entire song rather than pick that one word that was really good that one time, because I really want that consistency. And I think the same thing when you're talking about like drums or bass or any sort of instrument, like kind of going for that give and take to see like how natural can I make this feel while, kind of secretly behind the scenes, it's actually like, it's Hollywood magic the whole time, where right. Like you're looking through and like, maybe your edit looks like a rainbow in Pro Tools. And you're picking single words. Like you ultimately want that to feel as though it was just done one time. And it also comes down to the style of the band that you're tracking and the process that you're working on. But, even when it comes down to like, say, tuning or something like that, looking at like, particularly the vocalist, like when I'm going to tune a vocal, because as like coming from the more artist perspective, I definitely like to pick my takes when it comes to like vocal stylings. If I'm going to tune my vocal or somebody else's vocal, like I'm going to do that manually, unless stylistically it wants something automatic, like if there is like an auto-tune feel to it, or if there is, if it's a modern production, or say we're getting into hyperpop and it's supposed to feel like really crazy and really all over the place, and the tune's supposed to be like, feeling like a waterfall all the time. I'm going to go in manually and I'm going to do each individual thing. And I may not even hit like perfect tuning on each thing, because I ultimately just want it to feel like that singer's natural timbre. Yeah. And as you get into, crazier and crazier tunings, you find that, maybe your format of the vocal is adjusted, which is kind of like, the overall timbre of the vocal, whether it's pulling to more of like a treble side or more of a bass side.
Yeah, I mean, and that's such a great point too. And this is maybe, will be a good segue into, deliverables in terms of what you're actually sending, and whether it's you're sending processed stuff or unprocessed stuff like we talked about, because this is kind of that last thing where if you're trying to go for a natural feel, then the vocal should be tuned, and you should want to be able to say, hey, what I'm delivering, what the producer is delivering to the mix engineer, or if you're an artist doing it all yourself and you're, farming it out to somebody, what you're delivering from a tuning standpoint should probably be like your idea of like, hey, this sounds natural. I don't hear it, or anything I hear I'm okay with, right? In terms of sounding natural. Or on the same flip side of it, Tom and I are working on like a very pop centric, like vocal effect driven project right now. And in that way, it was funny because we got, went through, I kind of like chopped it up, did some production motifs, and did an arrangement mock-up. And then we got all final takes back, and the artist was actually like, just sent like just raw takes, right? And they were like, well, I like didn't know if you wanted to tune them or whatever. And I was like, no, like I loved the way you were processing it, because you were intuitively like putting the type of hyper auto tune processed effect on it, and you were knowing how those takes reacted to it. It's like, I kind of love that. So I was like, honestly, don't be afraid. Like, don't be shy. Like, go put it back on, process that in the way you were. Because if you're like, especially for that style, it's like, if you're too dialed on, then auto-tune isn't reacting the way you want it to. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's a thing where that becomes like, hey, that's how you should try to deliver something. You know, if that is so inherently, I almost look at it at that point as as an extension of the instrument, right? Like,
it is.
You know, you can say, cool, here's a vocal. Can you make it something interesting? And then the auto-tune effect becomes a mix decision. But in that way, it's a production decision before it even enters into the mix, you know, the mix realm. So if that's the case for you and you know you want something to sound like that, then you should definitely, at the very least, send that as a reference if you're going to also send like raw unprocessed tracks, just to be like, this is the sound I'm going for. Sure, if a mix engineer wants to go back in and try to beat it or adjust something about it, then you might know. You know, then they have that ability to do that. But 9 times out of 10, it's like that's, you know, your way of like tuning it, quote unquote, or your way of processing it. So you're giving them the actual effect. It's the same thing in a lot of ways as committing to a guitar chain, committing to an effects chain. You know, when you're sending that out, it's like, cool. Then you don't have to write this like whole dissertation, like page long description of the exact chain of like this gain through this reverb, through this chorus, then into this delay, you know, with these settings. You can just do it and give that to them, and then they know exactly what it is and can intuitively be like, right, I get the space that this is filling and what it's doing. So I think that's a really good point too when you talk about like picking takes and or like processing your own vocals before you send them out. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's definitely like a function of, and again, like you guys kind of spoke on this earlier, of just like kind of like when it comes time to commit and consolidate, like making sure that you're sending your mix engineer exactly what it is that you want at the end of the day. And like for you guys, you know, I know that you've dealt with all sorts of different engineers and have sent, I'm sure, different, you know, deliverables and all sorts of different kinds. But I mean, when do you find that you guys are sending stems versus sending whole session files? Is that just a conversation between you and the mix engineer or whoever it is that this is getting sent to?
I want to make a differentiation of some stuff. So, so like multi-tracks would be like the like kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, like all your recorded tracks as like individual tracks. Like if you opened up the session, these are the audio tracks. Whereas like stems would be like consolidations of like, this is the kick bus, this is the drum bus, this is the synth bus. Or at least that's how I deal with like my clients.
A lot of the stuff that you get, yeah.
Yeah. So like differentiating between multi-tracks, session files, and then the stems itself. So like if I'm getting stems to mix, either one, I'm going into it a bit handicapped, which is fine, but it's something to be noted. Or if I'm getting the multi-tracks, then like again, it goes back to that initial thing that we were talking about of like, is this a live band? Is this a pop production? What's my gain structure look like on that side? And that can be decided whether it's the multi-tracks or the session file.
Yeah. I mean, so Adam, to kind of further answer that question in terms of files versus sessions, right? So stems are a great way that if an artist already has a vision or is capable, that they can just keep their overall vision, baked into what they're passing on to a mix engineer. But also sending sessions is a way to do a similar thing if you're working in the same DAW, right? So, say you communicate, hey, I really love your work, Tom. I love what you did with, so-and-so's single. I've been working on a track out of my home studio. Like, do you run Pro Tools? Because my session's in Pro Tools now. And be like, yeah. It's like, well, honestly, then just consolidate
Send the
everything.
SOT. Send the file.
Just send the session. And sometimes too, this also goes a long way to say, it depends on how long you've been working on it, how many hidden tracks, unused tracks, things like that. Get rid of those so there's no confusion, right? So do a mix prep session where you are deleting all unused files and all unused tracks, right? Getting rid of everything that's not part of the final session is a really important thing too, because you never know how something could sneak back in. In a DAW, it's easy to just like hit a track on the side if you have your track list open, and like all of a sudden that one pops up and you're like, oh, this is the one, when in reality that was an old take or just like a different sound that they didn't like that they hid, right? So that's a good practice. But then the session allows you a couple things too. If you talk about their process, it kind of gives you a peek behind the artist curtain, and yes, that you will have their balance, their rough mix there, but then you will be able to see the intent behind a lot of the rough mix too, and you can say, oh, cool, okay, they're using this kind of chain on the vocal. Okay, I get that. Well, I think, in my opinion, I could probably punch that up a little bit by adding this to it, or, oh, that's cool, but I'm going to use this piece of analog gear in place of that plugin, and route it out and bounce that track down. Things like that you can start to be like, cool, I'm not straying completely from their vision, but I'm just elevating everything because I know where they were trying to go and I can see it, right? As well as, it saves a lot of time if they're like, hey, if you're dealing with somebody, and Tom and I have, people that are like professional audio engineers and sound designers. And, there's no reason not to just say, hey, if we have the same software and the same third-party stuff, just send that over and I'll have all of those tracks. You know what I mean? Like, and then I can do any like chopping up I need to do. But the sounds will be the same, and, the settings will be the same starting point that we can use. And that a lot of times can make an artist feel more comfortable knowing that you understood exactly what they wanted, instead of having to build something up from scratch, and maybe losing parts of the balance that they were already really liking, So, if you can do that, and if you're doing things in a DAW, or, have that communication, right? Or say, sometimes if someone is like unclear of how to properly bounce stuff out, I mean, there's plenty of videos online that can help with that. But occasionally I'll just be like, hey, if you have a whole thing in Logic that you love and you just want it to sound better, sure, send it to me and I'll see. And maybe it's a thing where I can just print out some quick stems and then take it off from there, right? Take it into Pro Tools and do what I want to do. Or I can take a look and say, this is great. Here's what I need you to do. Bounce out the tracks like this, and don't, just like commit the automation and do this so that all those little moves are already in there, baked into the track, but then I can, process the individual files a bit better and a bit nicer. So there's parts that, that make each appealing. But generally speaking, if it's just you picked an engineer, you found them, somebody recommended them, and you're going to send them, here are the deliverables, and it's the audio files, give them as much as possible, unless they say, hey, boil this down, just send me the stems if you can, right? And maybe that's where like the last thing that we'll kind of get into is exactly, what to send, how to send it, how it should look from an organizational standpoint, so that you don't get a mix engineer, so that you don't want to waste their time, right? Especially if they're like quoting you based on a number of hours, and you want them to be able to sit down and start diving in and being engaged by the track as quick as possible. So having these things in place are really relevant to making sure they don't spend an hour trying to sift through and like decipher what you just sent them, So Tom, start us off. Let's talk about like if they're exporting stuff for a mix, right? We've done all the editing, everything sounds great. Double, triple checked everything. What should they do, and how should it look?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple different ways that you can label your files. Typically, if like there's you want to put whether it's a lead instrument, rhythm instrument, like let's call that the like the prefix on the